5 of the Best is an opinion-based series on films which I have seen released during the chosen year. This is to celebrate previous years in film, not to cause any offence. All opinions are my own. Hi everyone, welcome to 5 of the Best, a series in which we celebrate movies year by year. This series of videos will consist of me discussing my 5 favourite films of this chosen year. Today's video we're talking about the year 2008, so let's get started. Before we get into our top 5, here are a few honourable mentions from this year. The Boy in the Striped Pyjamas, Wall-E, Defiance, 7 Pounds, 21, The Hurt Locker, Iron Man, Gran Torino, Rock'n'Rolla, The Wrestler, The Strangers, and In Bruges. Now, let's get on to the list and start with number 5. Cloverfield is directed by Matt Reeves, and the whole film is captured in a found footage style. Now, one of the reasons I want to start by talking about Cloverfield in the found footage style is because I have previously spoken about this. If you've been on the channel for a while and you've been subscribed and you've seen a lot of my videos, you'll have seen my movie study on the found footage subgenre, a film where I talked about more the underappreciated films, but I did also mention briefly in that video Cloverfield as a film and how much I really enjoyed it, and inevitably it was certainly going to appear at some point in this list, as it is definitely one of the standouts of the subgenre that is found footage films, and something that Cloverfield really encapsulates well, because when I talked in that video about what kind of wide variety that we've had in this found footage subgenre of things like party films like Project X, things like the Blair Witch Project, obviously iconic in its capture of horror and realism, if you like, and something that Cloverfield does, and it's the only real one that I feel that stands out on that list, that kind of breaks away from any of those kind of genres that they apply themselves to, because you apply the found footage but then you apply things like comedy or you apply horror. But in Cloverfield, it is the one that sticks out in my head that seems to have done it the best, because what Cloverfield achieves is the found footage, and again, I did say a lot of this in that video, so apologies I'm repeating myself, but something that the found footage enables, and it's something that this subgenre I felt is the best thing that it had, and it is quite sad that it is quite dormant as a subgenre now. But what it had, it gives like a surrogacy to the audience. It gives a unique feeling of being in the scenario with the characters. Because the characters in Cloverfield, they aren't in any way memorable. And that's not to say any performances are particularly bad, because what they're overall to do is just amplify the realism of the situation, especially in a scenario like this kind of apocalyptic, and then obviously after, as we come to the end of the film, post-apocalyptic reactions to what has happened. It's all about maintaining a level of realism, a level of believability, and through the found footage nature of this, that's what achieves it best. And I find of all the films I've talked about for found footage, previously in that video and now in this video, I find that Cloverfield captures it best, because it also has the terror. There's a lot of horror elements in this film, and it could be classed as a horror, kind of like a sci-fi horror film, because it does have the sci-fi nature with obviously the CGI of the monster in the film, and I find Cloverfield to be a real triumph of recent films of this nature. And when I say films of this nature, that makes it sound like there's a lot like this. And in a lot of ways, Cloverfield is a very unique film. And you might say, oh, but there's 2 films after that. Isn't it 2? Maybe 3? Because you had 10 Cloverfield Lane, and then you had the Netflix own Cloverfield Paradox, where 10 Cloverfield Lane is its own film, a very different film, and also has a lot of quality in very different ways. And Cloverfield Paradox was a very forgettable entry, which was a shame, because as a fan and someone who really, really enjoys his first film, and I felt that the second film, in 10 Cloverfield Lane, with people like Mary Elizabeth Winstead and John Goodman, it it was setting itself up to be really good, and then I felt that the Cloverfield paradox just said, no, we're not doing that, cut that off. But in this first film, it seems to have kind of been forgotten about, or not forgotten about, maybe that's too harsh, but it seems to have just drifted out of memory, if you like, for moviegoers. But I feel that Cloverfield is a really unique experience, and I would recommend it to anyone. Cloverfield is really good. It is a film that encapsulates everything that a found footage film wants to be, but also in a, end of the world style apocalypse film. It also is one of the more standouts in that genre too. So I would recommend Cloverfield to anyone. Number 4. Tropic Thunder is directed by Ben Stiller, stars Ben Stiller, Jack Black, Robert Downey Jr., and a handful of others. So of course I should always preface this by saying comedy is very subjective, and in Tropic Thunder that probably is one of the best examples, because Tropic Thunder is quite a satirical comedy. It has a lot of, let's say, questionable choices, let's say, in this film. Certainly nowadays, you certainly would never get a film like this made nowadays. With it only being 2008, it wasn't that long ago. It does show just how much culture has changed, and some things shouldn't be laughed about, and rightly so. But that doesn't take away from the actual genuinely good comedy that Tropic Thunder is. And while, as I say, a lot of the choices are a bit questionable, and in hindsight probably shouldn't have went as far as they did in Tropic Thunder, the comedy and the story throughout, it's one of the better comedies of this kind of, as I would class it, this kind of modern golden age of comedies, the kind of 2006 to 2012, 2013. Around that time we had a lot of really, really good comedy films that varied from a lot of different things like Shaun of the Dead to something like Tropic Thunder, which are both very different comedies. And while I would certainly say Shaun of the Dead is a more superior comedy, what I found in Tropic Thunder as something that's very different, it also had a lot of the hilarious dialogue, and I think what a comedy is built on is the character interaction, how well and the chemistry, because in a lot of films, whether it be action, whether it be horror, whether it be any genre, obviously a large part is character interaction and the chemistry, and also the charisma of each character and how they bounce off each other. That works in most things. But I find in a comedy, that is where it's nearly as important as it ever has been. And for something like Tropic Thunder, these characters, people like Ben Stiller, people like Robert Downey Jr., who's on this kind of bounce back of his career, if you like. We had Kiss Kiss Bang Bang, and then now in 2008, this is the year really of Robert Downey Jr.'s return. You have Tropic Thunder and you have Iron Man, and we know what Iron Man is today. We know the long trajectory of what that revitalization of his career did from Iron Man onwards, and it shows. But people really forget that he's in this film in some ways, because obviously Iron Man really takes center stage as his forefront of return, if you like. And for Tropic Thunder, it's a genuinely good comedy film. You've got people like Jack Black who are as good as they've ever been. You've got Ben Stiller, who is the comedy beats in this film are so smartly written, and for him to have written this film, directed this film, and worked on it just in general along with Justin Theroux, you've got such a, you can tell it was a passionate piece he cared about. And that's something that, I mean, I'm not the biggest Ben Stiller fan, I'll admit that. And I know something like Zoolander you would have maybe expected me to put on my list when I did whatever year that was, it came out previously. I'm not a massive fan of Zoolander. Shoot me, I know, but I'm not that much of a fan. But for Tropic Thunder, I found that Ben Stiller, you could see the passion shine through. And in other characters, people like Steve Coogan is great in this for his role. People like Matthew McConaughey, and the one that has to be mentioned and it just is the standout, memorable one of this whole film is Les Grossman, played by Tom Cruise, who around the time was in maybe not as much of a hole, if you like, as Robert Downey Jr. in far as career goes, but Tom Cruise was maybe in a bit of hot water, let's put it that way. And for him to come into this and really just have a laugh at himself and become this kind of very, very different character than Tom Cruise has ever played. He's not really a comedy actor, and it hasn't really been since. I can't really it doesn't spring to mind a comedy that Tom Cruise has shone in the way he did in Tropic Thunder. And in Les Gros, and while it isn't his, like, you know, he isn't the star of the show or anything, far from it, but from what he is, he steals the show. Him along with Bill Hader as his kind of counterpart in the film, and their dynamic. It's wonderful comedy. And you know, it is that comedy thing. It's a bit like when I talk about horror films. You either laughed or you didn't. And for me personally, I thought Tropic Thunder was a hilarious comedy. It's a film that I always watch every so often, you know, every few years I would always go back to, and I find Tropic Thunder to be one of those comedies that it's just a smart comedy. And you might say, oh, well, it's not smart nowadays because of the things it did. Sure, and that's absolutely right. And in hindsight, I'm sure even the directors and the writers and Ben Stiller would probably say, do you know what, maybe a little bit too far. With things like Simple Jack, things like Robert Downey Jr.'s character in the film, obviously the obvious reason of why that would be scrutinised. Yeah, I mean, I can understand that. But for me personally, I found Tropic Thunder, and even just the story, you know, this kind of generic war film they're filming that becomes the scenario, but you've still got the comedic tendencies between the characters. It's a great time, and I would recommend Tropic Thunder to anybody. If you're easily offended, maybe not. But if you enjoy this kind of comedy, I would definitely give Tropic Thunder a go. Number 3. Taken is directed by Pierre Morel and stars Liam Neeson and Maggie Grace. So Taken is a film that is an interesting one. Because of course you've got, I mean, everybody knows the iconic scene, the I will look for you, find you. You know, she's lying under the bed, she gets kidnapped, he speaks to the kidnapper on the phone. You know the scene I'm talking about. Everybody's seen it, there's been parodies. It was probably the most talked about film for that period of time when it was released. And Taken certainly holds its place in kind of action film history, if you like. And for someone like Liam Neeson, who I wouldn't ever categorise as a action hero, if you like, because he has played a lot of roles that, you know, films that have action tendencies, The Phantom Menace, Batman Begins, these films that, you know, while he's not the main protagonist, he certainly has action scenes, but I would never have struck him as a John McClane, a die-hard lead, or, you know, even more recently in someone like Keanu Reeves and John Wick, where you can see the badassery, if you like. That's definitely not a word, but I'm going to use it. But for someone like Liam Neeson to see, I seen this trailer when it came out, and I remember thinking to myself, as I'm sure a lot of you did, Liam Neeson in an action film as this kind of run and gun, you know, action hero, interesting. But once you see the first Taken, you know why the casting was right and why this film is so memorable. And when I talk about films like this, I you know, we've had this chat so many times, and I've said this quite a lot on this series already, about the saturation by sequels. Because Taken 2 and Taken 3 are such a dip in quality from the first one. Not to say that the second and third films are absolutely awful, that's not the case, but they're just such a drop in standard from what Taken 1 has. And this first film, I think is brilliant. I think Liam Neeson in this role, the story and the dynamic, you're instantly rooting for him as the hero. He plays this kind of stoic hero that you can understand his, you know, his anger, his drive, his passion to get back his daughter in this scenario, but also his passion to hunt the kidnappers. And I find this film to be really good. I actually rewatched it for this series because I forgot, you know, it's only whenever I go back and I look through the list of all the films that are coming out for each year, and I go, oh yeah, that came out. And Taken was one I kind of was, pardon the pun, taken aback, because I stopped and I went, okay, Taken's an interesting one. I'm going to go and rewatch this film in particular, because a lot of these films, you know, I'll have seen maybe more recently in a rewatch than, you know, some others. And for Taken in particular, I don't think I had seen it since about 2000 well, this came out in 2008. I probably rewatched it in maybe 2010. And I found that Taken was a film, I found this film really good. like a really top tier action film, taken away from the sequels, just taken on its own, and it, you know, as a standalone, you know, guy saves his daughter in really generic terms. Taken is brilliant. It's really, really good, and I wonder how much it would stand out if they didn't make the second and third films. I suppose we'll never know. But for something like Taken, it's a film. If you're into your action films, and if you thought like me at the time, Liam Neeson really as this kind of die-hard action hero, I don't know about that. Give it a go. Give it a go, because Liam Neeson and actually a bit understated through this, and especially in this first film, Maggie Grace as his daughter in this is actually really good as well. She gives a brilliant performance as his, you know, captive daughter, but you can understand the angst, you can understand the stress that he is under, but also there's not a whole lot told to us as the audience about his background. We kind of learn it as the story progresses, and we know obviously he has some kind of military history, but to see that these guys have taken Liam Neeson's daughter and he has to go in and he has to fly across the world with very little to no information on tracking down his daughter, and the way he does it, Taken is great. Taken is great, and I genuinely, it surprised me how good it is when I rewatched it, and I would definitely encourage you to rewatch it if you have seen it before and you've seen it all those years ago, or you hadn't seen it at all and you thought, oh well, I heard the second and third weren't great, so I'm not going to bother. Watch the first one. You don't have to watch the second and third. Watch the first one. Let me know what you think. Let's move on to the next one. Number 2. Step Brothers is directed by Adam McKay and stars Will Ferrell and John C. Reilly. Now, when I say things like comedy is subjective, that you've heard a million times, and when I always talk about comedies, I always start it like that. Comedies and horrors, they're always the ones that are subjective. If you laughed a lot, you probably loved the film. If you were scared by the horror film, you probably would recommend it to a lot of people. If you didn't get what you wanted, it's probably not that. And in something like Step Brothers is probably the most Marmite comedy of all time. And you probably fall into two categories. You either don't like Step Brothers because before you've seen it, you heard everyone quoting it, every scene, every line to you, whether that be in the schoolyard, whether that be in workplace, whether that be wherever. Step Brothers is probably one of the most quotable films ever. Never mind just comedy films. At some point in the last 10 years, you have definitely heard on multiple occasions lines from Step Brothers. And there are so many I wouldn't even know where to start with using one as a quote. It's not like it has one or two standout quotes. Literally, nearly every paragraph of dialogue from every character in this, whether that be Will Ferrell's character, Brennan, whether that be John C. Reilly's character, Dale, whether it be his father, Will Ferrell's mother in this, his brother, any of the characters, nearly every line is quotable. And I suppose when I said they're fall into two categories. If you're on the category you don't like this film, it's probably because you've heard every single line 100 times, and then you went and seen the film and went, well, it wasn't that funny because I'd heard every single line. Get it? And I understand that. I totally get that. But I was someone that, when I first seen Step Brothers, I seen it around the time of its release. It wasn't like I had been told by everybody and their mother to go and see this film because it's funny. I saw Step Brothers when it was first released, and Step Brothers, to me, is one of the funniest comedies ever made. And I think that will probably stand the test of time for me, because it came out at the perfect time, it was the perfect age, the comedy dynamic between Will Ferrell and John C. Reilly. I spoke earlier when we were talking about Tropic Thunder, about comedy, the dynamic between characters being vital in comedy films. And in this film, it probably is as good as it's ever been. I would argue maybe Superbad, the dynamic between Michael Cera, Jonah Hill, and Christopher Mintz-Plasse possibly rivals it. But I think Will Ferrell and John C. Reilly and Step Brothers have the greatest comedic exchanges there is for so many times throughout this film. They are on point. The delivery, the acting, but also just the natural charm, the natural funny charisma that both of these actors exude in a lot of their roles. And I'm sure, well, Will Ferrell in particular, I mean, we've seen him in so many things, and I'm sure he'll appear on these lists in the future years as well. But for Step Brothers in particular, I think there's been no finer comedy partner to Will Ferrell than John C. Reilly in Step Brothers. And I just think the comedy in here is so smart. It really rides the line of smart and silly, because we all like to have a laugh. We all like, we have a laugh at silly things sometimes, but we also like to have some serious laughs. And this film rides the line of brilliant. It's fantasy comedy in a way that, like, these scenarios are fantastical, but also they're quite real. These scenarios, you can understand in some ways how the characters would be feeling, because this is a pretty realistic situation that they're in for the most part. But to have these two bouncing off each other, they're dynamic, they're just so, to start as rivals and become these essentially brothers more than stepbrothers by in the middle part of the film. It is, and for it's not a long film, and most comedy aren't that long anyway, but in an hour 35 minutes, or around that time, it just is the right, it's the cherry on top when it comes to comedy films. And I think Step Brothers does everything right. And I do get that criticism, but the criticism itself isn't the movie's problem. When I said they're about people that have had it ruined for them, it's ruined because it's so good. It's ruined because everybody was talking about it, and if you didn't see it when it first came out, people still quote Step Brothers to this day. So many iterations of quotes that have, 14 years it has been since this came out, and there's probably still probably as many people quote it now as they did then. Step Brothers is one of my all-time favourite comedies. If you haven't seen it, and this is the first time you're thinking, oh well, I might go and watch it, or I might take the time out of my day to go and watch that. If you do, and you go, oh, I've heard that before, and that's only 5 minutes into the first scene, you'll be doing that a lot. So try and go in with an open mind. Hopefully you've not been saturated by these quotes that ruin the film for you. It's just, Step Brothers is so good. So good. It's always, when people ask me what my favourite comedy film is, it's always in the top 3, I would say. Maybe even top 2. It's always there or thereabouts, because Step Brothers it hits all the right marks, it ticks all the right boxes, and it just is exactly what you want in a not so serious, but can be serious at some points, comedy film. And that's why I would recommend Step Brothers to literally anybody. If you haven't seen Step Brothers and you love these kind of comedies, give it a go. However, it's not my favourite film of 2008, because, as you've probably already guessed, my number one is The Dark Knight. It is directed by Christopher Nolan and stars Christian Bale, Heath Ledger, and Aaron Eckhart. Now, I bet that was a surprise for you. I bet you didn't think Dark Knight would be number 1 of 2008. Of course, the best film of 2008 is Dark Knight. The best film of most years is The Dark Knight. The Dark Knight is... Where do I start with this film? A film that so many have talked about. It's been such a staple of film history over the last 1.5 decades. It is the pinnacle of comic book films in a world now saturated by comic book films. And don't get me wrong, there's a lot of quality ones that have came since The Dark Knight. A lot of films that I really loved on the Marvel side of things, but also a lot of DC films. But for me personally, The Dark Knight is the first comic book film that I found truly was a masterpiece. I think The Dark Knight, people argue maybe Spider-Man 2 was the first truly great comic book film, if you like. I don't agree. And not to take away from the quality of Spider-Man 2, or Spider-Man 1 for that matter. I know Spider-Man 3 is its own thing. But I think that while the Raimi trilogy it certainly sets the standard in some ways, but also kind of doesn't have that underlying quality, you know, that the Dark Knight has. And I think that something like Spider-Man 2, while it is definitely one of the better Marvel films, certainly certainly prior to anything in the MCU that obviously started this year too with Iron Man, The Dark Knight is just so far above the quality of that. And I don't think even with Infinity War and Endgame, which being the kind of two pinnacles of the MCU so far, I don't think either of them touch The Dark Knight in any way. I think The Dark Knight stands alone, not only as a wonderful comic book film, but just simply one of the better films ever made. I think it's right up there with Nolan's work, and that says a lot, because Christopher Nolan, and I talked about this when I talked about The Prestige, and I talked about, you know, when you see directed by Christopher Nolan, it adds a certain, you know, interest or intrigue already, because you know the quality you're getting. You know, in the same way that if it was directed by somebody like Steven Spielberg, or, you know, one of the or Ridley Scott, you know, or one of these big time directors that you go, okay, well, I'm a fan of some of their other work, so yeah, I'm in. Let's give it a go. For Christopher Nolan and the repertoire that he has now, this kind of booklet of truly cinematic masterpieces that Christopher Nolan has, there certainly is an argument to be had that he is right up there with the great directors. You know, he probably already is at least top 10 ever. I mean, the argument can probably be made for top 5. He is wonderful, and what he brings to The Dark Knight, and also it didn't make the list of the year, but for Batman Begins as well, before we talk about The Dark Knight here, because I'm going to talk about quite a lot, you know, there's a lot to delve into for The Dark Knight, but I want to talk about a bit of the, you know, the stuff that came before. And in Batman Begins, I find that quite an underrated film. And people, when they talk about the Dark Knight trilogy as it's known, you know, Batman Begins, this film, and The Dark Knight Rises, you've got 3 brilliant films, I feel. I think Batman Begins and Dark Knight Rises are both great too, but The Dark Knight itself is far and away the superior film. And that's, I mean, I'm not breaking any new ground here. This film has some of the best performances. You've got one I want to start with, actually, and this is probably going to be quite a surprise, but it's Aaron Eckhart. Aaron Eckhart as Harvey Dent in this film is actually one of the better, I think, one of the most underrated performances. Because everybody talks about Christian Bale, and of course everybody talks about Heath Ledger. We'll talk about them in just a minute. But some of the other characters, and particularly for me, I found Aaron Eckhart really good as Harvey Dent, and it goes a bit understated, obviously, with, you know, the limelight rightly taken by Heath Ledger and Christian Bale. But I thought Aaron Eckhart in this film as Harvey Dent, as this kind of middle ground antagonist, you know, to Christian Bale's protagonist, I find really the dynamics in this film are so interesting, and that's something that keeps you gripped from the start all the way to the end. The kind of not only the political side of it in Gotham, but also just the intrigue of these people. You know, you can understand, and there's not like there's, you know, when we look back in the 90s or whatever it was of the, you know, the Batman Forever or Batman and Robin, and you just have these villains who are villains for villains' sake. And that's something that I think always held him down. You know, somebody like Jim Carrey as the Riddler kind of stands out, where he just appears in this over-the-top green suit. Mr. Freeze, Arnold as Mr. Freeze. You know, and I know those films as a whole are not in any way, don't have the quality, but something that these films in particular, the villains they feel real people. And I suppose that leads me on to Heath Ledger as the Joker. Now, I'm not going to say anything here that hasn't been said before, because this is probably one of the most talked about performances in the history of film at this point. Because Heath Ledger is the Joker, and obviously, you know, the devotion he had to this role and the performance that he gives in this film is right up there with the greatest performances and probably most memorable performances in recent history, but probably in movie history over the longest period. Because obviously with him sadly passing not long after this film, and that kind of in a weird way solidified the quality of this, you know, and it kind of, his legacy will live forever now in kind of a beautifully sad way. Heath Ledger's performance in this, and the way he, you know, the scene that always stands out to me for this film, you know, it's the film, and it's the scene in the film where, you know, the Joker's being interviewed by Gary Oldman, who also is pretty good in this too. You know, saying Gary Oldman's good is, I know, it's just like saying water's wet. But the dynamic between Batman and Joker in that scene, the interrogation scene in the police station, you know, when he does the laugh properly for the first time. You've got the kind of understanding between you know, Bruce Wayne and the Joker, and it's just, this film is such a... The more I think about The Dark Knight, the better it gets. And it's weird because there's so many films over the years, and you can probably think of a lot of films yourself, that if you watch them on repeat, you go, ugh, you know what, I didn't actually like it as much as I remembered. The Dark Knight is one of those films that I watch it probably every few years. You know, I seen it when it came out, then I rewatched it when it came out, and then I probably seen it about a year later than that, and then I probably skipped a few years, watched it again. But it was actually last year, during the middle of everything, we had our cinemas reopen, and we got a lot of rescreenings of these kind of legendary films, and I got to see things like The Lord of the Rings, which was a real treat. Got to see things like Shaun of the Dead. Got to see, you know, a lot of these films that were brought back. Things like Harry Potter as well. A lot of these films got brought back, but one of them that we did get to see was The Dark Knight. And it reminded me, you know, seeing it in a cinema, seeing it with, you know, the surround sound and the cinema experience, it reminded me, you know, and I went in a bit like, you know, I would recommend doing this with so many films. If you go into it pretending you know nothing, pretending you don't know that The Dark Knight Rises exists, you know, you don't know all the films that have came since. You know, obviously we've got the new iteration of the Batman with Robert Pattinson, you've got, you know, the Joker film, you've got all these films that have came out, you know, since. But if you just think this is the first, you know, if you come in fresh, I really find The Dark Knight to be a masterpiece. And, you know, people, I mean, don't get me wrong, people wax lyrical about this film, as I really have been for, you know, while I've been talking about it here. The Dark Knight is everything a comic book movie should be, and more. And in some ways, it's everything a movie should be, because it just, it's exactly what the director, the actors, the script, just everything that they want to achieve with The Dark Knight. They surpass what it should be. This film should be great. What it actually is a masterpiece. And The Dark Knight is as good a film. It is right up there with the best films made in the last 10 to 15 years. It really is. It is the highest of quality. When people talk about this film and talk, oh well, it is so good, what's your favourite film? Oh well, I really like The Dark Knight. And people go, oh well, that's a bit cliche and all that. It's not cliche. The Dark Knight deserves to be, you know, at the top of a lot of people's lists. Is it my favourite film ever made? It's not. But is it right up there with my list? You know, when I'm talking about films that I really love and really appreciate, The Dark Knight is so high up there for me. The Dark Knight is a film that it'll be hard to replicate something like that. And you might say, oh well, you really like the Batman. I did. I really did. The Batman in 2022 is a film that, and when I talked about it in my initial thoughts review of the film, I loved everything about it because it wasn't The Dark Knight. And I love both of the films. And is it better than The Dark Knight? No, I don't think so. But is it close? I found both films so great in very different ways. To have two completely, and I said this in the initial thoughts video, so I'm probably repeating myself, but to have two films that are very different, they're near enough like different genres of film, it feels like. They're so drastically different, but they have the same center character. the dynamic is similar, let's say, but to have two completely different films that are both brilliant, it certainly ensures that the Batman is one of the best comic book characters for me, and certainly the one that translates the best to the screen. The only one that would argue would probably be Spider-Man, but I think for Spider-Man the quality of their films vary a lot. You know, you have things like Spider-Man 3, and you have things like The Amazing Spider-Man 2, but then you have things like Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, you have things like Spider-Man No Way Home. You know, the quality of those films vary a lot. I find for Batman films, and I suppose, well, yeah, I suppose that probably applies too, because when I mention things like Batman and Robin, and Batman Forever, and Batman Returns, you know, all these films that they just aren't anywhere near the quality of what The Dark Knight is, even what Batman Begins is, The Dark Knight Rises, the Batman, or even the Joker. I suppose you would probably put that in the same kind of category. The Dark Knight is just, it's so good. It's so good. I could go on and just repeat things that you've probably heard other people say as well, but there's no point. You know how good that, you knew, as soon as you clicked on this video, you've seen 5 of the best, 2008, you go, oh well, that's going to be The Dark Knight, it'll be number 1. I'd be amazed. You're probably clicked on the video, more reason to go, see if he hasn't put that number 1, I'm going to go mad. It's not, yeah. It's number 1. It deserves to be number 1. Dark Knight would be number 1 of basically any year. It more or less any year, because The Dark Knight is just so good. The quality is of the highest level. You've got Christian Bale given one of his better performances, and that says a lot. You know, you've got all the supporting characters and people like Michael Caine, Gary Oldman, you know, Morgan Freeman, you know, even Cillian Murphy for the small part that he plays in the film. You know, Eric Roberts as the, you know, kind of signature mafia villain, you know, just even Maggie Gyllenhaal. You know, a lot of these actors that they just shine. The cast of this film shines. And I use this, I don't really talk about this too much, but also the lighting. It's a very atmospheric film. It's a film that it really captures the essence of the darkness. That really, I don't know if that's wordy or even makes sense, but I hope you get what I mean. Like, it captures what it should. You know, it really sets the scene for these actors and these performances to really be elevated. And yeah, The Dark Knight's so great. We'll drift off easily into waffle territory here, so I'm not even going to put you through that. But The Dark Knight is so good. And here's something I thought, you probably thought you'd never hear these words, but I would recommend you go and see this film called The Dark Knight. It's pretty good. It's, you know, you might not have heard of it. It's alright. You know, I think you might enjoy it. No. Everybody has probably recommended it. If you haven't, everybody's seen The Dark Knight. And if you haven't, you've probably heard a million people say, oh, well, you definitely should see The Dark Knight. Give it a go. Give it a go. I say that for all of these films, but there's not many more. If you haven't seen it, who hasn't seen The Dark Knight? On the very, very slim chance that you haven't seen this film, please go and see it. Just please. Do it for me, do it for the million other people that have probably recommended it to you as well. The Dark Knight's so good, and that's why it's number 1. So that's been the year 2008. A really good year. A really, really good one. Probably the highest amount of honourable mentions that we've had to date. And let's start by doing that, because you know I always like to, in this summary part, just talk about which ones were close to breaking into the top 5. Let's see. I think realistically the closest that came to breaking into the top 5 would have been, I would say, The Strangers. The Strangers is, I think, one of the better horror films, and was so close to breaking into the top 5. But I thought, the more I thought about it, the top 5 was pretty set for me, and they were close. Something like Iron Man, while I don't think is, you know, anywhere near the kind of quality of, you know, any of the bigger MCU films that came after it, it still obviously is significant because it set the tone, it set the stage for what came after it. So of course it has the cultural significance of that. But no, something like WALL-E was kind of close as well. WALL-E is one of those brilliant Pixar films. I mean, there's so many, but WALL-E's definitely one of them. Yeah, just a really strong year. And then talking about the top 5, you know, films, you know, Cloverfield definitely had to be there in some capacity. You know, when I talked about it in the found footage film video, I just thought, you know, when we get to this year, when we get to 2008, it's definitely one that I'll be talking about in length. And I wanted to give it the time to talk about it because I think it is so good. Then we had the comedies. We had Tropic Thunder, of course, that just, you may love, you may not, but I just think, for me personally, Tropic Thunder was definitely one of those comedies that had to be included. And Step Brothers was undoubtedly being included. And Step Brothers is so good, and I wax lyrical there about it so much, so I'm not even going to repeat myself, but yeah, Step Brothers is so good. And then Taken is probably one of the more surprising ones. And I'll admit, when I came to doing this list, and obviously whenever I'm writing my notes about which films are going to be in the honourable mentions, which films are going to be in the top 5 and all that, I just instantly went, no, Taken will be an honourable mention. And then I think it was The Strangers, I think I had at number 5, whatever it was. But then I thought, you know what, I'm going to give it the benefit of the doubt. I'll watch Taken again. And I just really appreciated it. I really thought the quality of the film was so much better than I had my mind changed by rewatching it. And I would say that probably happened with a lot of films. You know, there's other, sequels that I would, originals, that films that have lots of sequels that I might go, oh, well, I don't really like the sequel, so that's probably subconsciously brought down my rating of the first film. I don't think that's right. I actually talked about it in Saw when we did, was it 2004, I believe, when we talked about that, and I was saying about how much I really love the first film, and the second film I really like too, but it just gets it's so bad by the time you get to Saw 3D or whatever the last one was. It's just awful. The final stand, just shut it. The Saw just falls off a cliff, and I find that just happens with so many franchises. But for Taken in particular, that was the one that I was very surprised by, and it was definitely included. And then The Dark Knight, I've just talked about it for so long there, I'm not even going to continue to talk about it because there's no point. The Dark Knight's so good. The Dark Knight is good. As I said when I was talking about it there, you probably clicked on this video just to see if it was there. Where have I put it? And is he going to stir the pot by not putting it number 1? Dark Knight's, The Dark Knight is so good. It deserved to be number 1. 2008 overall as a year was a real good one. And we're getting into kind of the, as we come towards the end of this, the noughties, if you like, or the end of the decade, as we come into the 2010s. And as I said before, my knowledge will certainly extend more from 2010 onwards. That was when I really became, a lot more into my movies. A lot of these films have been watched a lot after when they were released. Not all of them, but a lot of them I went back and watched, and that's why they're here in some capacity. And as always, I haven't seen every film that's been released. There's a few that probably I'll see in the future that I might go, actually, I hadn't seen that by the time I made this video, but I'll go back and add it in some, maybe put it in the comments or something that, it would be here in some capacity. But overall, just a really good year. 2008. One of the better years of this decade so far, and we've one more year to go. We've 2009, and then we're breaking our way into the 2010s, and then not long after that we'll be into the 20s, the roaring 20s as we're in now. And as always, I just really appreciate you taking the time out of your day. I know these videos are long; they're a long video, but just sit and take the time out of your day to listen to me. I appreciate you so much for it. The channel has been going from strength to strength, and this, along with the initial thoughts videos and whatever else is going on the channel and the TikTok and everything, it's been growing a lot. I just love doing this series. I love talking about these years. It gives me a chance to go back and not only talk about these films and share my thoughts on the real good ones, but also, there's a few films that I will go, and if I haven't seen it and the year's coming up that I'm going to make the video, I'll go and watch it, and then I find truly great films, and it's just such a great time. I really enjoy doing these videos. I really hope you enjoy them. If you do, leave a like, let me know. Subscribe, stick around. This series is ongoing. First of the month, every month, all the way through until we catch up to whatever year it is. By the time we're there, if we're in 2008 and we're in the month of, September, So if that's the case, it'll be, I don't know, early 2023 we'll have caught up to the present day, and what will happen after then, who knows. But until then, this series will continue to keep going, and I hope you're here for it. I really appreciate you so much, and if you're going to stick around, I will hopefully see you in the next one. Bye guys. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video. Before you go, here are some of my other videos. For updates and information on upcoming videos, the best place to find us is my Twitter. Much love everyone.